Most of us have at least heard of the Yemo and Manus reconstruction of the Proto-Indo-European Creation Myth, put forward a few decades ago by scholar Bruce Lincoln, and based on prior theories of Jan Puvel's. While useful for getting people to think about reconstructing the primordial myth, this reconstruction, which many casual students of the field take for granted, is deeply, deeply flawed. As a reconstruction taken from pieces here and there across many branches of mythology, but finding no full parallel in any actual surviving mythology, it is in fact a sort of patchwork Frankenstein's monster that has haunted the field of Indo-European myth studies for decades now. And when we look closer, we can see with certainty it is a myth that never even existed. When you adopt the Yemo and Manus reconstruction, nothing fits together very well thenceforward, and perhaps more tragically, you are also left with a severely dumbed-down version of the surprisingly very sophisticated theology of the actual Proto-Indo-European creation myth, which I have reconstructed in my videos and articles. In fact, the reconstructed myth offered to us by Lincoln, with its simplistic and meaningless theology, is too stupid to believe, which is why in reality no one ever did. It is very telling that Lincoln himself eventually abandoned attempts to reconstruct the Proto-Indo-European proto-myths because he found the results to be empty and found his own reconstructions to be nothing but a newly fabricated myth. In the end, he blamed the subject matter, the desire to reconstruct myths that he didn't think could be perfectly reconstructed anymore, when it was really his own errors that led him into a multitude of contradictions and an ultimately hollow mirage of a reconstructed myth. Yet it is also undeniable. This reconstruction of Lincoln's is still so convincing and convincingly argued that it has become a meme that almost cannot be dislodged from the Proto-Indo-European discourse. It is on Wikipedia. It must be real. It's almost the only version of the subject anyone knows. The Youtuber Crecganford, in particular, has fully identified himself with the theory of Lincoln and Puvel, repeating its claims over and over again in a long string of videos on his channel, while simply calling it the Proto-Indo-European Creation Myth. Crecganford and popularizers like him are unfortunately guilty of widely propagating a speculation without fully understanding it and its flaws, while representing it as an established fact. Many people seeking an intro to the subject of comparative Indo-European mythology are being misled by this uncritical repetition of a bad theory. It is my hope that Crecganford and internet influencers like him will publicly repudiate this theory when they have confronted its blatant flaws. For going beyond Lincoln is the actual breakthrough that will take the field to an exciting new level, and those like Crecganford have the ability to push the public discourse to that level. Just because an accredited scholar such as Lincoln has made a speculative case that seems convincing, that doesn't mean it is necessarily settled and proven. It continues to amaze me how complacent people are capable of being regarding a theory like this with so many inconsistencies. For me, the cognitive dissonance required to accept Lincoln's theory was a constant presence, and I could never sit satisfied with that. How long will the field be so easily satisfied with such a poorly fitted garment as this theory? I too once assumed it to be reliable. However, it is not linguistically or mythologically well-founded, or even coherent when subjected to close analysis. Furthermore, even when I say all of this and demonstrate just how flawed Lincoln's case is, many people are compelled to try to salvage some part of his thesis, as if he may have been half right, or that the branches simply changed so much that there is a muddling of the parallel that allows us to keep some of Lincoln's claims alive in our Proto-Indo-European reconstruction. This is the grip of his mirage, and is a sign that such a person still has not seen the case as clearly as needed. Indeed, close to every part of Lincoln's theory is hopelessly flawed and spoiled, as we will see, and trying to keep his mistakes alive in part only leads the reconstructionist to have to muddle the perfectly clear sacred myths that have been kept alive and mostly intact for so long. Thus, let's truly gain clarity on this issue so that we can fully outgrow the entirety of Lincoln's seductive but fatally misleading framework. As the scholar Edgar C. Palomet has said in criticism of Lincoln's theory, quote, "Some elements of the Scandinavian myth of Ymir are distinctively Indo-European, but the reconstruction proposed by Lincoln makes too many unprovable assumptions to account for the fundamental changes implied by the Scandinavian version." Unquote. Let's see just how far this problem goes. Let's take a look at the details. Firstly, and most crucially, the linguistics underlying Lincoln's theory, the linguistics on which everything rests, have been fudged. The two names that Lincoln equates to found his comparison, Norse Ymir and Vedic Yama, are actually slightly different in meaning and in form. Sometimes a slight linguistic difference isn't significant, but other times it's of utmost significance. In this case, the slight difference in name meanings is the first red flag that should have been heeded, but Lincoln equated the names without regard for the difference. And most commentators who only read and regurgitate Jan Puvel's or Bruce Lincoln or the Wikipedia summary then simply try to gloss over this issue. Yet even Bruce Lincoln admits that the linguistic connection is not actually exact, but that he is having to assume it is close enough, quote unquote. The question is it? The issue is that although the name Ymir is connected linguistically to Vedic Yama, to the extent that they are both said to come directly from words meaning twin, this is a misrepresentation of the facts. Ymir, as we will see, means double and not twin, and this makes all the difference. Bruce Lincoln himself only says that the names Ymir and Yama are, quote, intimately related, a vague assertion that allows him to smooth over the gap, to make it seem like the names are closer than they are, despite not being perfect formal matches and not having the same meanings. Words can often be intimately related, but not be the same words with the same meaning. An example my colleague Josephus suggested is how guilty and guiltless are intimately related words from the same root, but mean opposite things, a fact which is plain to anyone who knows the language. Nonetheless, Lincoln thinks, quote, intimately related words are good enough in this case, and builds his whole theory on this faulty foundation. However, we will return to the exact details of this linguistic problem later in the video. Lincoln claims that his reconstructed Proto-Indo-European figure, Yemo, was the primordial sacrifice, but as a result of this claim, he has to fudge the fact that the actual Vedic Yama and Iranic Yima, who this reconstruction is largely based on, are never themselves depicted as the first sacrifice in the actual texts that we have. Lincoln fudges this by first assuming he has categorized them correctly, and then, when they are not depicted as such, he says this fact has, quote, already been lost. Always note when Lincoln says something has already been lost, because it is usually a red flag that he is forcing the texts to fit his theory without solid evidence to do so. As he says, quote, as we shall see, Norse accounts retain the fact that Ymir, see Yemo, was the victim in the first sacrifice, a fact already lost at the time of composition of Rigveda 10.90. 1200 BC, and Yasna 32, 1000 BC, rejecting the traditional date. He continues by saying that the credit for recognition of this parallel should go to Jan Puvel, who was kind enough to read and comment on an earlier draft of my manuscript. If we are correct, the Old Norse account preserves certain details from the Proto-Indo-European myth that have been almost completely lost in even the earliest Indian and Iranian texts. Unquote. This should have given him pause, but he wanted to press ahead, fudging the idea that Ymir is linguistically equivalent to Yama, and then fudging the fact that Yama and Yima are not the first sacrifice, one after the other, forcing a second error to try to make these ancient texts fit his first error. A fact already lost? You don't say. In reality, it is only Lincoln's theory that has the hole in it, and not the Vedic and Iranic texts. Requiring these ancient texts to be wrong in order for your reconstruction to work should have been the next major red flag, and stands out as a glaringly poor argument in retrospect. Pressing onward, he then is forced to also fudge a non-existent connection between the Vedic Yama or Iranic Yima and the Iranic figure Gyomard. Gyomard being the true Iranic parallel of Ymir. Lincoln does so by simply asserting that, quote, behind, unquote, Gyomard was an earlier Yima. This again despite the facts of the texts themselves, which are that Gyomard and Yima appear as totally separate figures with completely distinct myths, and that their epic versions, Keomars and Jamshid, appear as entirely distinct figures in the Shahnameh epic, Jamshid even being the descendant of Keomars, each with entirely separate and fleshed out myths in that epic poem. As Lincoln rationalizes it, quote, Iranian evidence supports this hypothesis, for behind the figure of Gyomard, we may discern the older figure of Yima. The way in which this transformation took place is somewhat complex, unquote. There was no such transformation, since these are not the same deity and never were, and any complexity to make these pieces fit together is a post hoc rationalization. What is the mythos of Yama then? Vedic Yama/Iranic Yima and the Iranic epic version of the same, Jamshid, are never even on the primordial scene. We can't remind the listener enough that although Lincoln brings Yima and Yama into the question as an example of a creation myth, Yima and Yama themselves are never part of a creation myth and are born well after the creation. They are never part of a primordial creation myth in any of the actual extant texts, and we have 3 examples of this to go on. Yama, Yima, and Jamshid. That is to say, Yama and Yima aren't in the earliest part of the creation myth. Their parallels, like Bran and Dawn, do appear in the very last level of the creation myth, but after the Celtic Perusia event, as we can see. In addition, Yama isn't sacrificed at the sacrifice that he goes to. Rather, he, quote, chooses mortality, unquote, there. This is Rigveda 10.13.4. Which some, like Lincoln, have confused with becoming the sacrifice itself. Stephanie Jameson and Joel Brereton, in the notes to their Rigveda translation, clarify this highly vague passage that has misled many, and which Lincoln uses as a main piece of his argument. Quote, verse 4 of hymn 10.13 veers off in a different direction and alludes obliquely to what we might call the Felix Culpa, or fortunate fall, of Yama, who, though born immortal, at least according to Rigveda 1.83.5 and possibly 10.17.1, chose death over immortality in order to sacrifice to the gods, para A, and produce offspring, paras B and D, whereas the gods constituted their sacrifice through Brihaspati and avoided death, but also do not reproduce. So roughly Geldner, unquote. So in short, Lincoln has taken a vague passage and read into it the fact that Yama is becoming the sacrifice at this sacrifice of Brihaspati, and has projected this non-primordial sacrifice onto the earlier primordial scene, and then equated this Yama with an entirely separate divinity who is the primordial sacrifice on the primordial scene, without even thinking that a later sacrifice could be an echo of an earlier one, but not the same. We can be fairly confident that he isn't killed at the sacrifice itself, because, as noted, it is at this sacrifice that he makes the choice to have offspring and to give up immortality, which implies that he subsequently has these offspring. This is what we see in other parts of his myth, where he has offspring with the figure who is his twin sister, Yami, and then dies later in the killing by Zahak in Spitura. So it does not seem correct that he dies at the sacrifice where he chooses to give up his immortality, but only later. Jamshid, the Iranic epic version of this god being cut apart in his myth, which Lincoln further uses as evidence, is instead simply the parallel of Ymir being beheaded. For when we reconstruct the full Yama-type mythos across all branches, he corresponds to the beheaded gods Mimir, Orpheus, Bran the Blessed, and the Gaelic Don Bo. Mimir's beheading could in a sense be seen as an echo of Ymir being divided, since Ymir is divided into sky, which is his head, and earth, which is his body, effectively separating his head from his body like a beheading. No wonder these two different types of violent cuttings are being confused by Lincoln, since they already echo one another, perhaps even intentionally. Yima echoes his ancestor Gyomard, as Mimir in some ways echoes Ymir, both being beheaded. But the later echo is not the same god as the earlier. They have their own unique roles within the theological structure. Next, Lincoln brings in the brother of Yima, named Spitura, and tries to claim that he is a variation or replacement of Manu. The passages from Scripture which name Spitura are as follows. Quote, Spitura, he who sawed Yima in twain, unquote, from Yasht 19.46. And, quote, Yim, or Jamshid, Tamhurasp, Spitur, and Narsi, whom they call the Rashnu of Chino, were all brothers. Spitur was he who, with Dahak, or Zahak, cut up Yim, or Jamshid, unquote, from the Bundahishn 31. So Spitura is one of several other brothers here. He is not called a twin ever. He does not sacrifice his brother, but cuts him in twain along with Zahak. This is a vengeance killing. And there is zero indication that he is the same figure as Manu, especially since Vedic Manu doesn't ever sacrifice or cut Yama either. This section of the argument is very questionable and unclear, and most crucially of all, the cutting of Yima is not presented as a sacrifice or in the primordial moment. Spitura's name and character are also nothing like Manu. If there was any replacement of Manu by Spityara, which is an assertion of Lincoln's based on very thin claims, it is unlikely that Lincoln has the full picture of what was going on in that regard, and what its theological implications were. Because the preceding sections of his argument were fallacious, we must assume that this section is also framed falsely by the conclusions of those preceding sections. Why would we assume Spitura is replacing Manu at all, when again, Manu never even kills Yama, which is what Spitura does, let alone sacrifices him? Lincoln says that another scholar, Dandekar, is the scholar who most effectively argued the case that Yama is just a version of the Perusia, the primordial sacrifice. But if you actually look at Dandekar's book, he doesn't argue the case at all. He flatly states that Yama is probably a version of Perusia, and leaves it at that. This is the effective argument that underlies this massive claim. This seems to be a case of arguing from authority by gesturing to another scholar's work that vaguely supports what Lincoln wants to claim. Lincoln quotes Yasna 30.4, saying the good and evil spirit were like twins, the word being Yima. This is a common way of referring to the dual principles in Zoroastrianism as twins. This refers to Spentamainu and Angramainu, the dual principles, not to Gyomard and Angramainu or Ahriman. However, nor does the fact that Spentamainu and Angramainu are called twins make them the same god as the much later appearing Yima, who is actually named Twin. The brazen bastardizing of theology is going deep at this point, all to make it fit his pre-made theory. Lincoln then says that because this good spirit is connected to life, the word being gaim, that he would be the precursor to Gaiomard, which means mortal life. The stretching of both thin and inaccurate connections at every step of this patchwork argument is too shoddy to trust and often hard to believe. He has now implicitly said that Spentaminyu, the good twin, who is an aspect of the creator god Ahura Mazda himself, is the precursor of Gaiomard, who somehow was Yama, because Spentaminyu is connected to both twinhood and life. And this thin thread of similarity is supposed to be convincing that these entirely separate deities that he hasn't shown to be equivalent should be considered one and the same without any more definite evidence than both being connected to common concepts such as these. We read from the scripture, quote, "Now the two primal spirits, who reveal themselves in vision as twins, are the better and the bad, in thought and word and action. And between these two, the wise ones chose aright, the foolish not so. And when these twain spirits came together in the beginning, they created life and not life. And that at the last worst existence shall be to the followers of the lie, but the best existence to him that follows right. Of these twain spirits, he that followed the lie chose doing the worst things. The holiest spirit chose right. He that clothes himself with the massy heavens as a garment, so likewise they that are fain to please Ahura Mazda by dutiful action. About which he in the beginning thus thought, let the blessed realms be filled with light. He it is that by his wisdom created right. Those realms that the best thought shall possess, those dost thou exalt, O Mazda, through the spirit, which, O Ahura, is ever the same." Unquote. We must further note here that Gaiomard is mortal life, and that is very specific. He is only mortal life. In a way, calling Gaiomard mortal life is a way of reducing him in stature. He is not all life. He is not the divine life of the gods. He is restricted to the material mortal world, which emerges from him. This is the same as with Ymir, who is only the sky and the earth, the material world, and mortality, which is connected to death, is what emerges from these figures. The gods themselves and all that is immortal do not emerge from mortal life, the god of mortal life. Whereas the life that is being connected to Spentaminyu, one of the divine aspects of Ahura Mazda in this passage, that involves the ultimate life, the divine immortal life. And so the life that Lincoln is trying to connect to Gaiomard is an all-encompassing life, different from the restricted mortal life of Gaiomard. And so these two concepts also cannot really be equated. Lincoln then claims that Yasht 19.30 through 39, where Yima loses the Jvarane, the sovereignty and glory, by a triple process, is a version of the dismemberment myth that we see with the Perusia, even though Yima is not at all dismembered in this myth. This myth, as I have shown in my Celtic Adam and Eve video, is instead paralleled by Diarmid, losing the sovereignty goddess by a triple process. Again, not an event of dismemberment in the Gaelic case either, and no evidence it ever was one in any branch. In sum, we have to emphasize that Odin and Ymir are not twins or even brothers in the actual myths. That Odin killing Ymir is not the same as the Perusia sacrifice, since Ymir is not the parallel of the primordial sacrifice, the Perusia, and that Odin attacking the sky-earth unity that is Ymir instead parallels Rudra attacking Java Prithvi, the earth-sky unity in Rig Veda 1.71 and 10.61, as I have explained in my creation myth and father sky videos. We have to emphasize that Odin is not even one of the very first beings, thus he is never wandering the void with Ymir, as Lincoln's supposed reconstructed myth would have it. Bruce Lincoln has to entirely erase Buri and Bor, Odin's grandfather and father, and Odin's other ancestors from the record in order to say that originally Odin was one of the primordial cosmic twins wandering the void. To ignore the fact that Odin has two parents and two grandfathers as well simply shows that Lincoln doesn't understand who those deities are or their massive importance going back to Proto-Indo-European theology. But Buri is Prajapati himself, who Lincoln has already shown he doesn't understand by equating him as well with Ymir, when Prajapati in fact is Buri, and Ymir is Sky-Earth, Java Prithvi. Thus, at 2 points, Lincoln's failure to understand that Buri is Prajapati, or that Buri is important at all, has caused him to think he can simply erase him from the myth and assume he was just some filler added in at a later date, and that Odin had originally been without parentage, as well as a twin of the primordial Ymir, both things that never occur in any of the actual texts we have. It's not even always clear whether it is Manu or Yama who is meant to be the parallel of Ymir. At times, it is clearly Yama that is equated to Ymir, but then when it comes to the name of Purusha, meaning man, and that of Gyomard, meaning mortal life, Lincoln implies that Manu, meaning man, also has an alignment with these two figures, as the primordial man or mortal. But he has just said that Yama is the primordial man, and Yama and Manu are brothers and separate figures. In other places, Odin instead is supposed to be the main parallel of Manu, as the killer of Ymir. So Lincoln freely mixes Yama and Manu together as he likes, as long as it serves his purpose, cross-threading these separate deities as if the ancients had not a single care in the world about the unique identities of their gods. This is no problem for Lincoln only because he has the presupposition that the theology of the ancients was utterly fluid and without any important structure. But do we really believe that a lived religion as sophisticated as that of the Indo-Europeans really operated this loosely? Is aligning both Ymir and Odin with Manu in this way, and both Manu and Yama with Gyomard and Ymir and the Purusha, really a clean and convincing argument that has been made with care? Does this argument produce a picture of a religion that we can really believe ever existed and was believed in as truly sacred? Or can it only give us a picture of a tradition where stories were mixed and matched haphazardly and without a deep underlying meaning? Crucially, it is impossible for Ymir to be the Purusha, the primordial sacrifice that Lincoln claims he is, because he is not the primordial fire being. Instead, Ymir is a frost giant made from melted ice flows. The Purusha is explicitly and always a being identified as the primordial Agni, or fire, while Ymir is the opposite in nature. The Purusha is ether and fire. Ymir becomes earth and the hard skull dome that is the sky. Tellingly, Ymir is formed by heat from the primordial fire, just as Java Prithvi is formed by the aforementioned Agni Purusha. Ymir does not divide into all things, as the Purusha does. He divides into only earth and heavens, just as Java Prithvi, sky-earth, does. Other beings external to Ymir, dwarves and the atmospheric air, have to fill the space between Ymir's two halves and hold them separate, while in the Purusha sacrifice, nothing external intervenes between his parts, because he is all things, including anything which could intervene. This is how you can tell Ymir is not the totality in the way the Purusha crucially is. The division of the Purusha's parts is essentially a drawing of lines, a division that happens within consciousness, but not a true separation. Nor does the Purusha actually die in his sacrifice in the Vedic mythology, whereas Ymir is at least represented as dying and becoming passive in a sort of permanent way. The Purusha is instead made more energized and refreshed by his sacrifice, which only burns away his impurities and allows him to generate. See Shatapatha Brahmana 6.1.1, verses 5 and 6, and throughout the Shatapatha Brahmana, where the identification of Purusha with Agni, fire, is constant. Sky and earth are only one set of 16 different emanations from the Perusia in the Rigveda Purusha Sukta. Yet, sky, earth is all that Ymir is. The Purusha's immortality is one of his most important aspects. He is immortal fire that emanates all things from his flaming ethereal body. Ymir, like Gyomard, mortal life, is at least aligned with mortality in his mythic role. Mortal and material life, not immortality. Lincoln continues, quote, "Insofar as Ahriman, that is Angra Mainyu, is an original conception of Zarathustra, some other figure must have played his part in the pre-Zoroastrian version of the myth. If our evidence from India is to be trusted, we would expect an Iranian figure corresponding to Sanskrit Manu to take this role." Unquote. The figure who played the part of Ahriman in the pre-Zoroastrian myth was not Manu, as he asserts here without proof, but the Rudra-type god, as I have shown. It was always the Rudra type here attacking the dual sky-earth unity. It was always Odin, Averfin, Ephnician, and Cronus as this Rudraic attacker. It is in fact more accurate to say that Ahriman, the spirit of hostility and destruction, is just a demonized form of this Rudra god, who is in fact the destroyer of the Vedic pantheon, rather than that a different, much lesser god like Manu was in this incredibly central mythic role in the earlier form of the myth. Ahriman's only creation is the peacock, a bird that is a symbol of Rudra Shiva and his son Skanda in Hindu tradition. Odin much more clearly matches Rudra, as scholarship has more and more confirmed. See Chris Kershaw's book, Odin and the Indo-European Mannerbund. Odin, meanwhile, parallels Manu not at all, another core issue with Lincoln's broken framework, and so the problem of trying to equate the exalted Odin with the minor demigod Manu in itself should be close to a refutation of the whole parallel. Thus, another baseless claim of Lincoln is disproven by understanding the full picture of the myth more fully and accurately. Manu was never in the role of Ahriman, just as his victim, Gyomard, was never Yima. Ahriman is simply the demonized Rudra god who was always in this same mythic role. This Rudra god perfectly parallels Odin, while Odin parallels Manu not at all mythically, and only superficially in any other common traits. Let's look at the linguistic problems now, which completely demolish any remaining hope for the theory. As noted at the beginning, the linguistics that Lincoln bases his entire mythic comparison on are not even correct, and collapse upon analysis. And even Lincoln acknowledges that the all-important linguistic connection between Ymir and Yama is only an intimate relation, quote-unquote, in other words, a close enough. Yet, as we will see, this close enough is not at all close enough for the comparison to be accurate. As Lincoln puts it, quote, "It is here that the Old Norse version best preserves the Proto-Indo-European heritage. Old Norse Ymir, as Güntert first demonstrated, is derived from Proto-Germanic Yumiaz, Y-U-M-I-Y-A-Z, which in turn is derived from Proto-Indo-European Y, schwa with the subscript 2, M-I-Y-O-S, Ymmios, Y-M-M-I-Y-O-S, as it might be written in a more modern orthography, a term intimately related to Proto-Indo-European Yemo, Y-E-M-O, twin." Unquote. Intimately related, not the same, by his own admission here. He then even points out that this root of Ymir's name corresponds most closely to a Lettish, that is Latvian, word that means double. But double is not at all the same thing as twin, even if it is a related concept from the same word family. Quote, "This word, Ymmios, Y-M-M-I-Y-O-S, corresponds to Lettish, that is Latvian, Jumis, J-U-M-I-S, meaning double fruit. Middle Irish, Evin, E-M-U-I-N, twin. Latin geminus, twin. Avestan Yama, twin. And most significantly, to the proper names Avestan Yima equals Sanskrit Yama, which literally signify twin as well. Based on this phonological and semantic correspondence, we hypothesize that there was originally a mythic correspondence and that all are derived from a figure in the Proto-Indo-European myth." Unquote. We can see how quickly Lincoln slides here from Jumis, J-U-M-I-S, meaning double, to other words meaning twin that are farther from Ymmios, Y-M-M-I-Y-O-S, the word form in question, such as Evin and Geminus. This quick moving from Jumis to Evin, E-M-U-I-N, can be called a significant sleight of hand, since we can guess that Jumis, J-U-M-I-S, is closer to Yumyaz, J-U-M-J-A-Z, and its Proto-Indo-European root, Ymmios, Y-M-M-I-Y-O-S, than are Evin and Geminos, just by the phonetics and spelling alone. And more importantly, this is borne out by the change in meaning from double to twin. The fact of the matter is that Jumis, J-U-M-I-S, double, does come from a variation of the root Ymhios, Y-M-M-H-I-Y-O-S, while Evin and Geminos come instead from Yemos, Y-E-M-O-S. He has made a significant leap from Jumis, J-U-M-I-S, double, to Evin, twin, but lumped them together to distract from the fact that they are not really the same. He has also ignored the fact that the Latvian word Jumis can mean double fruit, but also paired couple, which is the exact meaning we will see is relevant to Ymir, and as should be obvious, a paired couple is not at all the same as a single twin. My colleague Josephus has here explained the fundamental gap between the names Ymir and Yama. In sum, they do not have the same meaning despite being etymologically close and from the same word family, and furthermore, they are not even formal matches linguistically speaking. They are different words, even at their Proto-Indo-European root. I quote from Josephus here, quote, "The Proto-Indo-European word for twin is reconstructed as Yemos, Y-E-M-O-S, to which laryngeals are sometimes added, H subscript 2, Y-E-M-O-S, or Y-E-M-H subscript X, O-S. Whether laryngeals are included or not, this perfectly matches Sanskrit Yama. Yama matches Yemos, meaning twin. Old Norse Ymir, on the other hand, cannot possibly be from Yemos, twin, or its variants. It comes from Proto-Germanic Yumyaz, J-U-M-J-A-Z, which has come from Proto-Indo-European Y, M with a dot below, Y-O-S, once again possibly with laryngeals, so example, Y, M with dot below, H subscript X, Y-O-S. We can imagine that both names, Yemos and Ymmios, Y-E-M-O-S, and Y, M with dot below, Y-O-S, ultimately do share a root. But even so, they would have different vowel grades, and the latter also has a suffix, Y-O-S. This doesn't look like the same name at all. The meaning of Yemos is undoubted, and Yama is in fact the usual Sanskrit word for twin. But what does Ymir mean? Latvian Jumis, J-U-M-I-S, which comes from Proto-Indo-European Y, M with dot below, H, subscript X, Y-O-S, means pair. Thus, everything becomes clear. Yemhos, Y-E-M-H, subscript X, O-S, is the twin, or one within a set of two. Ymhios, Y, M with dot below, H, subscript X, Y-O-S, is the dual, or double/pair, or one who is made up of two. Ymir is in fact dual in the myth. Both heaven and earth are fashioned from his body, supporting this etymology of mine. This kind of scholarly strawmanning is not unparalleled. The same has happened to Deus, D-Y-E-W-S, and Deivos, D-E-Y-W-O-S. Both names share the same root, but have different formation. The former is the name of a sky deity. The second is variously the common noun for God, or the proper name of the god of oaths. Failure to understand the difference has led some scholars to pointlessly speculate that Tyr, that is, Deivos, could somehow be the original embodied sky god, equals Deus, D-Y-E-W-S, despite the lack of any evidence for this, unquote. Josephus also points out that, quote, quite an issue is Lincoln's statement that, quote, Proto-Indo-European, Y, schwa, subscript 2, M-I-Y-O-S, or Y-M-M-I-Y-O-S, Yimios, as it might be written in a more modern orthography, unquote. For the more modern orthography would be something like Y, H with dot below, subscript 2, M-Y-O-S, but the actual reconstruction would be Y, M with dot below, H, subscript X, Y-O-S, unquote. Thus, even certain more minor details of Lincoln's linguistic representation of the case have flaws within flaws. Note that Wiktionary.com does state that Ymir's Proto-Germanic root, Jumjaz, J-U-M-J-A-Z, means twin. But we must remember that this is marked as a speculative reconstruction, and when we click on the one source for this entry, it is a single scholar who is basing the meaning on the presupposition that Ymir is the same figure mythically as Yama. That is to say, he is basing the speculative etymology on Jan Puvel and Bruce Lincoln's mythic theory. Tellingly, this scholar has even marked the meaning of divine twin at the beginning of his entry with a prominent question mark, while also noting at the end of his entry the close connection of Jumjaz, J-U-M-J-A-Z, to Yumis, double. In fact, he points out that the root of Ymir, Jumja or Jumjaz, comes from the same Proto-Indo-European root as Yumis, that being Imhio, in his orthography I-M-H-I-O, while marking the roots of Yama and Evin instead as coming from the separate variations of the Proto-Indo-European root Yemo or Iemho, Y-E-M-O or I-E-M-H-O, variations of the same. We can see the same thing occurring in the Wiktionary root section, where the roots of Yumis, J-U-M-I-S, and Ymir are actually the same word, Imhios and Ymhios, I-M-H-Y-O-S, and Y-M with the dot below, H-Y-O-S. That is to say, the root of Yumis is traced to I-M-H-Y-O-S, and the root of Ymir is traced to Y-M-H-Y-O-S. As Josephus explains, quote, these are literally the same word. I-M and Y-M with dot below, variations of one and the same phoneme, would be in free variation in Proto-Indo-European, unquote. Wiktionary itself traces the roots of Yumis and Ymir to the very same Proto-Indo-European root. So, the listed meaning of the Wiktionary entry for Ymir's root claims that it means twin, but the actual source encyclopedia along with the listed roots on Wiktionary itself tell an entirely different story, so that it becomes blatantly obvious that the suggested meaning of divine twin, marked with a question mark, has been directly influenced by the speculative and ultimately incorrect mythic theory of Puvel and Lincoln. Therefore, to use this misleading Wiktionary entry as evidence that Jumjaz means twin, and therefore supports Lincoln's theory, would be the most ridiculous form of circular argumentation. To claim Jumjaz means twin, the scholar here has once again pushed aside or pushed to the end of his entry the fact that Latvian Jumis means double and matches Jumja, the root he's looking at, much more exactly, and instead he has slid the meaning over to make it fit with Puvel's and Lincoln's incorrect mythic reconstruction. This is how an entire edifice of errors gets built, a circular loop of mutually reinforcing mistakes that has the air of authoritativeness. Although Bruce Lincoln expanded and further popularized this theory, Jan Puvel actually proposed most of the theory first in his book, Comparative Mythology. And as Lincoln says, the name Ymir is, quote, intimately related to Yama, so Puvel similarly says Ymir is, quote, cogently etymologized as twin, unquote, without giving any argument or evidence of the fact. But he also says the name of the Celtic god, Lugos, is etymologized as raven in the same book, an etymology which is not accepted by any scholars that I know of today. We should remain wary of the hotly debated etymologies given by scholars like these, especially when they are not carefully proven with evidence that we can examine, as this one also appears to be simply wrong. In summary, Ymir's name root implies he is double, while Yama's implies he is a twin. And while similar, a double being is not at all the same as a single twin, and these are in fact importantly different. As Ymir is sky and earth in one, he is the being who is two in one, double, while Yama is one in two, a twin. The Latvian word Jumis, which actually shares its root with the root of Ymir, means double or even paired couple. Ymir as sky and earth is indeed the double being and the paired couple, that couple being the earth goddess Jord and the embodied sky god, who are his two halves. In many other branches, the unity of earth and sky that Ymir embodies is represented instead as a paired couple in an unstable marriage or sexual union, the sky god and the earth goddess in a union. Indeed, as I have discussed extensively in my Father Sky video, Dyava Prithvi, who is Dyaush and Prithvi, Father Sky and Mother Earth in union, and who thus is the earth-sky unity of the Rig Veda, is presented as this double being, this unity of these two deities in one single name, far more times than they are depicted as separate deities. Even more, Dyava Prithvi, this unified double name, is the most prominent double being in the whole Rig Veda, appearing with variations of this name about 100 times in that text, more than any other pair. Thus, it is fair to say that Dyava Prithvi is the double being and paired couple of the Rig Veda, perfectly matching the actual meaning of the name Ymir. So what is the real Proto-Indo-European creation myth? I have already laid out its basic form in my analysis of the Celtic creation myth and my video on Dyaush and Ymir, so please watch those videos for more information. But in a short summary, the absolute, symbolized by a pillar, emanates the cosmic breath and cosmic cow, called prana-viraj in the Vedas. The cosmic breath and the cosmic cow actually being two sides of one coin, as the frame and udder of the cosmos. The cosmic breath differentiates into bright fiery air and misty cold air. The fiery air congeals together into the primordial fire form being, who is the semi-embodied absolute himself, called the Perusia, this being Norse Surtur. This fire form, semi-embodied all-god, that is Purusha/Surtur, then emits the sun, the moon, and the wind, and also makes a unity of earth and sky materialize. This sky-earth unity is that Dyava Prithvi, this being Norse Ymir, who is the shell of the material egg, and the Purusha then enters this sky-earth material eggshell as a golden embryo so that he can be reborn into the material world. This golden embryo emerges from the heatless primordial waters, or ice, as the all-god of the newly made material world, this being Buri/Prajapati. Then this all-god, Buri/Prajapati, who is the reborn totality, generates from himself a son who is ardor or fury or desire, the overflow of his own passion. This furious ardor god, that being Vedic Manu, Norse Bor, and Gaelic Mil, then either fathers or directly turns into the Rudra-type god, who is the divine intellect and Mannerbunda god. This Rudra-type god is he who then cuts the sky-earth unity in two, while Sky is in the middle of an offensive progenitive act with his own female half. The Rudra-type god puts sky and earth in order and then eventually self-castrates or bursts his own heart, creating a bridge back to the divine for those who come after. Essentially, the Norse creation myth is already almost identical to the Proto-Indo-European creation myth in its essential details, with only some cosmetic differences or details left out. If we try to take Bruce Lincoln's version, on the other hand, we must assume the Norse myth as it exists to be completely mangled and almost unrecognizable from the Proto-Indo-European version. In addition, the Lincolnite has to claim that Odin not being Ymir's twin or brother, that Odin not being very similar to Manu or on the same divine level as him, that Odin not being one of the very first-born beings, but having multiple ancestors in the myth, that all of these facts of Norse myth are recent changes that have taken Norse myth away from its Proto-Indo-European original form. Indeed, as we have seen, Lincoln's version has to come up with a whole list of elaborate explanations to try to rationalize imagined changes, which are really just discrepancies caused by his own flawed framework. With Lincoln's theory, we indeed have to say that every single creation myth of every branch had this long list of changes in one direction or another, so that not a single branch kept the whole of the proposed myth intact. And indeed, it only thus exists now in the reconstructed form proposed by Lincoln, which is actually a purely hallucinated form. Not a single branch, apparently, could keep this myth straight, but every one diverged significantly from the original pattern. In my reconstruction, on the other hand, most branches kept the essential details of the Proto-Indo-European myth very close to the original, arguing for an incredible degree of care and conservatism regarding the details of this important myth. The case is simply that we have not known how to look at each branch from the proper angle to see how they already are, for the most part, in harmony. So, in reality, there are 4 layers, so to speak, or 4 different gods on different levels of the cosmology. First is the Perusia. The Perusia is the primordial sacrifice and the primordial ethereal fire being, formed from the primordial air and fire. This is Norse Surtur. He emits or forms sun and moon and sky and earth. Then is this sky-earth unity that he forms. This is called Djava Prithvi. This is Norse Ymir. Then comes the reborn Purusha, within the material world that has been formed, who emerges out of the dark and heatless waters, formed into a being within the material shell that Ymir embodies. This reborn Purusha is called Prajapati, and he is Norse Buri, who thus emerges from the frozen waters, that is the ice, after Ymir has emerged. Then a pair of children are born to the sun, which the Purusha had emitted. These children are Yama and Manu in Vedic tradition. The precise parentage of Yama's parallels in other branches, Mimir, Bran, Orpheus, and Dawn, isn't always the same as this, being children of the sun. But what matters is that Yama is born far down the line of emanations, later than the initial creation event. But when you have these 4 levels unfolding from the original Purusha, who himself is the totality, each subsequent figure may have echoes of the original sacrifice in his mythos, or other echoes of the Purusha in him, since all things reflect and are parts of the Purusha. The actual original Purusha sacrifice is that original primordial cosmic fire, emitting itself into all things. It is a symbolic separation of the primordial fire becoming all things, and that happens at the highest level, where we see Muspelheim and Surtur. These 4 levels that concern us here are like so, then. The Purusha, who is Surtur, Djava Prithvi, who is Ymir, Prajapati, who is Buri, Yama, who is Mimir. But Lincoln is insistently confusing these levels together, conflating these separate deities simply because they have some vague echoes and similarities between them. Seeing the names Surtur, Ymir, Buri, and Mimir, no one would confuse or conflate these figures, because we have a fairly clear grasp of Norse myth. It's only in Indo-Iranic material that people lack the clarity to actually understand the myths and characters of these deities in their proper context, and so can be misled into thinking they are all one and the same. Bruce Lincoln does to the Indo-Iranic material the equivalent of simply collapsing Surtur, Ymir, Buri, and Mimir all into one, eliminating all the important and frankly obvious differences between their equivalents, Perusia, Javaprithvi, Prajapati, and Yama. The general understanding of Indo-Iranic material must drastically improve so that this does not keep happening. See my videos on the creation myth and the Perusia for much more information. The fact that my reconstruction of the creation myth argues for things to be almost unchanged in the majority of branches is a much simpler hypothesis than all of the ludicrous assumed changes required for Lincoln's theory. Indeed, he requires us to believe that none of the traditions cared much about these sacred details, or if they did care, then that the people were too stupid to be able to keep any of them very straight. No wonder no sophisticated or even interesting theology comes from Lincoln's theory. We can see for ourselves that the opposite is the case, and Occam's razor itself recommends that we accept the theory that requires less elaborate changes and less complications that need explaining away. As such, Lincoln's theory must be discarded, and with great haste as well. Too many decades have already been lost following this will-o'-the-wisp of a theory due to our own too shallow and frankly too lazy grasp of the material. We have no excuses any longer, and ignorance isn't good enough. I'd like to credit and thank my friend and brilliant colleague Josephus for the linguistic breakthroughs in this video, without which the video wouldn't have been possible. I also would like to thank my other MythStream colleagues, Arno and Colin, for working through many of the details in this video over time, and everyone else who has discussed this topic with me. My book, Taliesin's Map, The Comparative Guide to Celtic Mythology, is available from Amazon, link in the description. Make sure you are subscribed to my channel for more groundbreaking mythology videos.